Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Bishop f8 to c5. Bishop c1 to a3. Castle kingside. Bishop f1 to e2. Pawn b7 to b6. Queen d1 to d2. Bishop c8 to b7. Rook a1 to d1. Pawn a7 to a6. Castle kingside. Queen d8 to c7. Rook f1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight d4 takes c6. Queen c7 takes c6. Bishop e3 takes c5. Queen c6 takes c5. Check. Rook f3 to e3. Rook a8 to c8. Queen d2 to d4. Rook c8 to c6. Rook e3 to d3. Queen c5 takes d4. Check. Rook d3 takes d4. Pawn g7 to g5. Bishop e2 to f3. Pawn g5 takes f4. Rook d1 to e1. King g8 to h8. Rook d4 takes f4. Pawn f7 to f6. Knight c3 takes d5. Pawn e6 takes d5. Pawn e5 to e6. Rook f8 to e8. Pawn e6 takes d7. Rook e8 takes e1, check. King g1 to f2. Rook c6 to d6. Rook f4 takes f6. Rook d6 takes d7. King f2 takes e1. Pawn b6 to b5. King e1 to d2. King h8 to g7. Rook f6 to b6. Bishop b7 to c8. King d2 to d3. Bishop c8 to b7. King d3 to d4. King g7 to f8. Rook b6 to f6, check. King f8 to g7. King d4 to e5. Rook d7 to e7, check. Rook f6 to e6. Rook e7 to d7. Rook e6 to b6. Rook d7 to e7, check. King e5 to d6. King g7 to f6. Pawn c2 to c3. Rook e7 to e6, check. King d6 to c5. Rook e6 takes b6. King c5 takes b6. Bishop b7 to c8. Bishop f3 takes d5. King f6 to e5. Bishop d5 to b7. Bishop c8 takes b7. King b6 takes b7. Pawn a6 to a5. King b7 to b6. Pawn a5 to a4. King b6 takes b5. Pawn a4 to a3. Pawn b2 takes a3. King e5 to d6. King b5 to b6. King d6 to d7. Pawn c3 to c4. King d7 to c8. Pawn c4 to c5. King c8 to b8. Pawn a3 to a4. King b8 to c8. Pawn c5 to c6. Pawn h7 to h5. Pawn a4 to a5. Pawn h5 to h4. Pawn a5 to a6. King c8 to d8. Pawn c6 to c7, check. King d8 to d7. Pawn a6 to a7. Pawn h4 to h3. Pawn a7 to a8, promoting to queen. King d7 to d6. Queen a8 to f8, check. King d6 to d5. Pawn c7 to c8, promoting to queen. Pawn h3 takes g2. Queen c8 to c5, check. King d5 to e4. Queen f8 to f5, checkmate.